Hi, this is Jim Bond with my beautiful wife Kathleen here in Cleveland, Ohio, on a snowy day. We're just so happy to be invited back to share our story at the Dana-Farber Patient Seminar. It's very kind of you to invite us. Thank you. Like many of you, I was diagnosed with a disease I'd never heard of, multiple myeloma. And mine was at stage 3 when I was diagnosed. And I was told by an oncologist at one of our 2 major cancer centers in Cleveland here that that I would only have three years at most to live. And I'm very, very happy to tell you that was 31 years ago that I got that diagnosis. So I'm very pleased to be able to say that to you. And I've also met other people throughout the years that have also survived over 30 years. So it can be done. My first 10 years of dealing with this transplant involved 3 stem cell transplants, well, 2 from my own cells, and 1 from my matching sister. And that was good. That got me the 10 years I needed. And then I was at a really bad point because there were no more treatments available. None of today's drugs were out. And I was told by my local doctor, it's time to go to hospice. And I brought up a clinical trial that I had heard about for an experimental drug showing really good results for sick myeloma patients like me. And it's noteworthy that I'd gotten that information from going out of town for a second opinion during those first 10 years. And that second opinion was at the Mayo Clinic, where my wife and I traveled, and they assured me that doing another transplant would be fine. And they agreed with the strategy. And I always like to ask the question, what's new and on the horizon? And that's how I got the information that there was this clinical trial showing really good results for really sick patients. So I brought that up to my transplant doctor here in Cleveland when I was in real trouble, and he was advising me to go to a hospice. And he said, "Oh, I know all about that." And he said, "You can't, there's no openings anywhere in the country, and you're just wasting your time to even try to get in one," which I thought was kind of odd, that you could be wasting your time when you're told to go to a hospice. And he was frustrated with my wife and me, and he walked out of his office. Well, I went back to my office and I made some phone calls and put in some calls to some likely hospitals that may have an opening. And it was a Friday afternoon that I'll never forget. The phone rang, and there was a British accented doctor on the other end of the line. And he said, "Jim, Paul Richardson here at Dana-Farber in Boston. I know a little bit about your story, and I only have 2 questions as far as you getting in our clinical trial." He said, "1, how soon can you get here?" And I said, "Well, tomorrow." He said, "Well, that would be Saturday." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Monday would be fine." I said, "Okay, Monday." And he said, "2, are you willing to live up here, relocate 600 miles from your Cleveland area home to the greater Boston area so you can stay in this clinical trial for 9 months?" And I thought, yeah, here's a guy talking 9 months when I'd just been told to go to a hospice. So I went home and started packing for 9 months. But I thought it was strange that my wife, Kathleen, was only packing for what looked like a weekend, but I was not feeling well, and I shrugged it off. But when my sister dropped us off at the airport, and she gave me a hug goodbye. It felt like she was hugging me goodbye forever, not just for 9 months. But again, I shrugged it off. We got to Boston. I got in a hotel, got through the night, and after a hiccup or two, started this experimental drug. And this is the most dramatic part of our story. Within 2 weeks, or in my case, 4 doses of this experimental drug, 99% of my monoclonal protein went into remission. And our clinical study nurse, the wonderful, now retired Deborah Doss, she was elated. She was running through the waiting room, waving the results and looking for me. And she said they'd never seen anything, such a dramatic decline in the protein, such a short period of time. And the drug company, as it turned out, had not seen anything quite that dramatic. So to me, it was like a miracle. And shortly after that, they announced I was in complete remission. And we stayed and completed the clinical trial. And that drug is now called Velcade. And it was approved in record time. And it truly did save my life. The American Cancer Society funded over $1 million in fundamental research that led to 3 doctors receiving Nobel Peace Prizes for their scientific work. And that work really opened up the pathway to what became Velcade. So there's a tie-in to the American Cancer Society, which I mentioned because while we were in Boston doing our 9-month trial, and I was working out of my home office that I had established up there, Kathleen came up with the idea to raise awareness to the American Cancer Society Hope Lodges. And those are where cancer patients stay free while they're being treated out of town. Kathleen is a longtime volunteer for the American Cancer Society, starting well before I got cancer. And she started out going door to door and worked her way all the way up to their national board of directors. But she agreed with me that the awareness of these Hope Lodges wasn't that great. And when people needed to get out of town to get a treatment, they couldn't get it home. They could be very critical. So she came up with this idea to raise awareness and money for the Hope Lodges around the country. And I said, great, what's your idea? She said, well, it's going to be a bike event. And it's going to be a 4-day event with riders riding from our city in Cleveland, Ohio, 328 miles south to Cincinnati, where there's another Hope Lodge or Hope Lodges in both cities. And I said, honey, that's a great idea, but neither one of us cycle and neither one of us own bicycles. She said, oh, not a problem. She'd work all that out. And I watched her work all that out. And it took her a couple of years. And the American Cancer Society teamed her up with a cyclist. And they mapped out the route. And the same cyclist gave me information because I decided I had to support Kathleen. And I went out and bought a bike and got the expert advice on how to train and how not to kill myself. And I decided I was going to ride. Well, the first ride was set to go, and she named the event the Pan Ohio Hope Ride. and the first event was ready to go. I think it was 2007. And before the event, we were at another myeloma fundraising event. in our downtown area. And a local TV reporter came up to her son and said, "Bob, do you think your dad can really do this? He's got some obvious effects from his cancer, which has not gone away. It's just still there in some form." And I got home in time to turn on the TV and listen to Bob's answer to that question. And he said, "Well, I don't know if my dad's going to make it all 328 miles or not, but I will say this about my father. When dad says he's going to do something, he'll do it." So I still do feel hugely touched by that. I also felt a sense of pressure, like I better perform. So I got on my bike, started the ride. It's not a race, it's just a ride, bike paths, country roads mostly. And with the help of our older son in front of me, guiding me along, and Bob's wife, Stacy, behind me, I managed to go all 4 days, 328 miles, which I never thought I could do. And it meant a lot to me. It meant so much that ever since then, I've been wearing a hat with 328 on top. And I did the same thing for 12 consecutive years. I rode all 328 days. And it's been a labor of love. And I do it not just to raise awareness and money for the American Cancer Society, but also because I strongly believe that doing daily exercise has played a major role in my staying alive these 31 years. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, this guy just said he had 3 transplants. How does he do daily exercise when he's doing a transplant? Well, here's what I mean by daily exercise. I use the phrase sit, stand, walk. So those days when the drugs for the transplant had me flat on my back in the transplant bed, I would make myself sit up in that bed as long as I could. And then when I felt comfortable and safe, I would stand next to my bed as long as I could. And when I felt pretty safe, then I'd grab the IV pole and go walking around the floor section until the nurses were tired of me being in their way. And they arranged for a treadmill outside my door, my room, so I could do my walking there, which I really appreciated. So things were going along pretty good. Our story was getting out. We were in a group who sponsored us to go around the country and share our story in person at support groups. This is pre-COVID. And my local nurse here in Cleveland, a fine oncology nurse, she said, "Jim, before you and your wife go on your next trip, stop by. I want to check your blood counts. You don't look quite right." Well, she was right. My platelets had fallen through the floor. And when she announced that, she said, "We have to do another bone marrow biopsy right now to find out what's going on." And I pleaded with her. I said, "Lee, you realize I've done over 30 of these bone marrow biopsies so far." This was in the year 2012. And she said, "Yeah, I know, but you have to." So I did. And I got the same transplant doctor, called a couple of days later. We were at home. And he said, "Jim, bad news. You've got leukemia. And it's worse than that. It's treatment-related leukemia. And what that means is the only way you can survive is if we are lucky enough to get your leukemia level, which is high, get it knock down and get you eligible for what would be a fourth bone marrow transplant. And this would be not from your matching sister, but from an unrelated donor, if we can find one that matches. And he said, that's a tall order. You're 64 years old. And he said, you may not want to do this. You may want to think about it. I said, no, that's fine. I'll begin. We'll get started. Hung up the phone. And that happened to be a wedding anniversary night. So we did our best to celebrate our anniversary. Got started, and he was right. That was a very difficult transplant. A couple things made it really hard. The medical team that did the rounding was trying to lower, in my opinion, my expectations of success. And I kept trying to boost them up, assuring them that we could do it. And my doctor finally came in and said, Jim, we got your leukemia level down low enough, and you're eligible for a transplant. And we found a person that matches your stem cells. And I thought, oh, that's great. My prayers have been answered. But before I tell you what happened next, I forgot a key part. Before I got to that part, I was having some very rough days leading up to the ready for transplant. I had 3 days where I was hallucinating, and without Kathleen being at my side, I probably wouldn't have made it at all. But she was there every day. I had to force her to leave, and she'd bring me pudding. It was about the only thing I could eat. And anyhow, I was feeling really, really down. One Sunday night at 8:00, my hospital room phone rang. It was Paul Richardson. And he said, Jim, I want to tell you what I just told your wife. Called her first. We've got other patients here at Dana that have gotten treatment-related leukemia like you've got, and they've made it. They've survived it. And Paul assured me I could do the same thing. Well, that meant the world to me, Paul. It still does and always will. And I know I'm not the only patient that Paul has done things like that for. It's really a tribute to the good fortune we all have to have the Paul Richardson and Ken Anderson and their colleagues and their support teams available to keep us going. It's a real blessing. So to take you back to my story, my doctor had announced that they had got me ready for a transplant. They found it a match. I was thrilled. And then he laid the bad news on me. He said, but Jim, we can't give you the person's cells. And I said, well, but you said I can't survive unless I do. He said, that's correct. You can't survive without them. And I pleaded with him. I said, well, you got to give them to me. He said, Jim, we've got a review board here at the hospital of transplant doctors, and some of them don't agree that you can live through this transplant, through a fourth transplant. And he wouldn't budge. And I said, will you just do me this favor? You go back and explain to them that 2 months ago, I rode my bike 328 miles, 4 days in the Pan Ohio Hope Ride to raise money for cancer, and see what they say. Well, he did. And he came back and he said, Jim, that changed their mind. They said, it sounds like he's got the mental and physical strength to get through this. We'll take a chance on him. So on Halloween, I got this person's stem cells. And by Christmas, I was discharged in remission on both the AML leukemia, and I was in remission on the myeloma for the entire time. And that's where I remain today, in remission. And I'm extremely thankful for that. Now, I did learn a couple of years after that that my donor is a woman living in Germany. And that kind of explained to me how I've had this urge to go to Oktoberfest ever since I got her cells. But more seriously, there have been some serious side effects from having this cancer and the treatments that went along with it. I'm 3 or 4 inches shorter than I was when I started. My back is twisted and curved. My left shoulder doesn't work. The bones are all broken. I got metal holding the top of the bone together. And I've got a hip that was replaced. And the hip doctor told me that when he was getting ready to replace the hip, he said he sees that from other cancer patients too that have to take steroids over a long period of time. It makes me at higher risk for avascular necrosis of the hip bone. And I said, well, what about my other hip? He said, well, it's good. Even though you're high risk, doesn't mean it's going to happen. But I took that to heart, and I started asking more questions when whatever drug I was taking for myeloma had a steroid added to it, because I knew that the longer I took steroids, the more my risk would go up. And I have been successful in having Paul or my home team of doctors agree I could try without the steroid, and it's worked out on other drugs. So it's something that I learned going along the way. I also learned that from a spot that had to be removed by the dermatologist on my skin, that I'm at high risk for more skin cancers because of having had a transplant. Just one will make me high risk, which it has. So they say, we want you in here every 4 months, whether you find a spot or not. And they check my skin. And honestly, they find 3 or 4 that they biopsy every time, almost every time. And then they have kept them under control. Fortunately, none of them have been melanoma. They've been basal or squamous skin cancers, and they've kept them at bay. But it's something, again, we learned as we went along. I think one thing that maybe is not as clear as others is second opinions is vital. Clinical trials obviously was extremely vital. I've done 6 of those so far. And we try to partner with our medical team. We don't try to, it would be foolish to try to boss any doctor around. That wouldn't work. But we also try to have a say and be heard when we have a point of view, because we know our story really well. And it's not fair to think a doctor could know all his patient's story as well as they do. So we think there's a legitimate part for a patient to play in arriving at a mutually agreeable decision. And that's worked out well, thanks to great doctors like Paul. The day-to-day most annoying side effect from cancer is graft versus host disease. It affects my skin and it's dry, my mouth, but mostly it affected my eyes. I couldn't see well enough to drive. It had caused the surface of my eyes, the cornea, to be scuffed and dried, and I just couldn't see. And through medical science again, we found a place that happens to be in Needham, Mass, that specializes in lenses that they had to train me to be able to work them, get them in and out. because they're great big, they're huge contacts I fill with liquid in the morning and take out every night, and they return my sight to normal. So that's another blessing. People hear our story and they say, Jim, you're just lucky. And I say, well, I totally agree that I am very, very lucky and very blessed about a lot of things, this being one. But I also say this about luck. I borrowed it from a collegiate golf instructor who, when he was instructing his golfers how to sink a very long putt across a very hilly green, he'd say to them, if you knock that ball in one stroke, of course you're lucky. But the key is you've got to strike that ball hard enough and get it at least to the hole, and thereby give luck a chance to happen. And I believe that's what we've done. We've done everything we could think of to give luck a chance to happen. And in our case, it has happened. And with all of today's drugs out, I see no reason why it can't happen to a lot of you as well. Now, before I turn it over to the beautiful Bond girl of 52 years to tell you about her side of the story, I will tell you that during the COVID shutdown, I sat down and wrote a short book, and the profits from that book go to cancer charities. They don't go to me. And it tells the story that I just told, hopefully a lot more clearly. And this is the book. That's the title, Man in the Arena, Surviving Myeloma Since 1992. And I also went on YouTube last summer and did many 4-minute episodes of lessons learned and strategies used, some of which you've heard in what I've said already, but others you may find of interest. So, and you can email me. My email's all over the internet. You can get it anywhere. Just Jim Bond Myeloma will get you all you want to know and more. So with that, here's the beautiful Bond girl of 52 years, Kathleen. Honey? Honey?
Thank you. Well, it's good to be back again this year. I would not have guessed when Jim was diagnosed in 1992 that we would be back talking with everyone again 31 years later, but here we are. And I heard Jim talk about the crucial clinical trial when we had to come to Boston, and how dicey that was, because he was really in bad shape and running 104, 105 fever. He was swelling up. It looked like his kidneys were starting to shut down. We barely made it to Boston, and we checked into the hotel right next to Dana-Farber, and I picked up the phone immediately and called Dana-Farber, and they said the doctor on call will call you right back. And the doctor on call called within 5 minutes, and it happened to be Ken Anderson. And he and I had never met, but he told me what to do to get Jim through the night, and we had hoped that Jim would get through the night so we could show up at the clinic to start the trial. And Ken said to me, Mrs. Bond, did anybody tell you that your husband is the 7th patient admitted into our study? So his study number is 007. And Ken said, I have to believe that's good karma. Well, clearly it was, because here we are once again addressing all of you. And we've been very fortunate, as you just heard Jim say, all along the way. And there were some real touch and go moments. But I can tell you when he was diagnosed, as many of you felt, it was a disease you probably hadn't heard of. We had never heard of it. And it was just such a kick in the stomach. And I remember thinking I was going to get mad and get even and do everything I could to learn about this disease so we could fight back. Well, back in 1992, there was precious little out there that was good news. I spent a lot of time in the medical school library with a medical dictionary looking up cases. None of it was good. And I kept saying to myself, well, that's this person. It's not Jim. And I didn't realize then how right that was. Now, when I look back at all of our years experiencing this disease, I realize that every myeloma case in each person is different. It's unique to the person. And I just hung on to that through all these years as we navigated our way. And the good news today is there's so many tools in the toolbox that we didn't have 31 years ago. And yet here we are talking with you. So I think the future looks really hopeful. Now, I can tell you, as Jim mentioned, we did develop some strategies along the way. You heard about the second opinions. Sometimes there were third, even fourth opinions. And we would sit down and talk about what felt right for us. What did we think we were comfortable doing? We were also very careful to make sure we kept our options open. So if we did A, we wanted to make sure we could still have option B or option C in front of us. And today there's so many options out there. So it's clearly an important discussion to have. But we were having it back then and through all these years of making all kinds of choices. But when we would talk about what felt right for us, we would make a decision and then not look back. We knew we had done our homework. We knew we were making a decision that felt good to us. We made our decision and we moved forward. And through all these years, we always managed to keep our eye on the horizon, to see what's out there, to see what's coming over the horizon. And as I said, there's so many new things coming that it looks really hopeful for so many of us. One thing we tried to do through all of this with the ups and the downs was stay in the middle emotionally. And by that, I mean this. When we would get bad news, we would not come out of the appointment, just completely crushed. We would come out of there saying, well, this isn't what we wanted to hear. This isn't good, but we know who to talk to. We know what's going on out there. We knew we could put together a game plan, and we would start to focus on the game plan and bring ourselves up to the middle emotionally. And that truly helped us navigate. But by the same token, when we got good news, we didn't come out of that appointment high-fiving each other. We came out of there saying, okay, well, this is good. We're where we want to be, but we know there's no cure yet. And we would bring ourselves back down to that middle emotionally and not let ourselves get too high and too giddy. Now, we did develop one strategy that really helped, and we call it our 8 p.m. rule. And at 8 o'clock at night, Eastern time, no matter what's going on in our world, Jim could be in the hospital, hooked to all kinds of IVs, all kinds of stuff happening. We are done with myeloma. In fact, we're done with any cancer. We're done. We don't talk about it. We don't deal with it because we know we're going to just forget it for the night and hit it the next morning. And I can tell you that really helped us get through a lot. And we have, to this day, we still use the 8 p.m. rule when we need to. And sometimes we use it for other things, but it was really helpful. And as we went through all of this, I can remember 2 Sundays, and I'll call this a tale of 2 Sundays. The one Sunday was going through Jim's first transplant. I remember standing there looking at Jim. He was laying in bed. He was completely out of it. He was on morphine. He had just finished 3 days of total body radiation twice a day. He had buckets of chemo. And this is back in 1993. Buckets of chemo. It didn't look good. I was really quite terrified of what was going to happen next. I remember that Sunday vividly. I also remember another Sunday, 1 week later. And that Sunday, 1 week later, Jim and I were sitting at our oldest son's college graduation. Jim wasn't hooked to a thing. We were able to travel by car to the graduation. Our son didn't even think we were coming, yet there we were. And it just goes to illustrate how quickly things can change when you're navigating through this disease and its treatments. I wouldn't have given you a nickel from one Sunday to the next that we would be sitting there at that graduation. Fast forward, Jim was home for a month, back at work after 1 month at home. Everything seemed normal. Everybody was good except for me. I was a mess. I was a jittery, nervous wreck because I knew there was no cure yet. And I knew it was going to come back. And I kept saying to Jim's doctor, shouldn't we be doing something? Shouldn't he be taking something? And the doc said, no, let's let this ride. I was a mess until one day, Jim had gone off to work. About an hour and a half later, the phone rang and it was Jim. And he says, honey, I'm okay, but your car isn't. And he proceeds to tell me how he was stopped at a red light. The light turned green. He started to move through the intersection when out of nowhere came a pink Buick that T-boned him on the driver's side, shoved him into the car next to him. I started screaming, what? How could you have an accident after all we've been through? I lost it. And as I heard myself losing it, I realized, whoa, lady, you got to get a grip, because we can't continue this way. I can't live this way. And I realized then that, you know what, we have today and we're going to enjoy it and take it as it comes. And I'm always keeping an eye out for a pink Buick or a pink vehicle of any kind. But it brings it all home to me that we need to just keep navigating our way and doing what we need to do. And I'd like to leave you with this, and this helps me navigate as well. To look around and do what's necessary. Then look at what's possible to do and attempt to do that. And before you know it, you may look back and realize you've accomplished what had seemed impossible. And I think that's the nugget of our story, because 31 years ago, it seemed so impossible that we'd be together here today, speaking with all of you. And we really appreciate the opportunity, but it was indeed possible. And I hope the same for all of you. And thank you again for having us. Thank you.